What I'm about to explain is a very important step during the refretting process, cleaning the fret slots prior to fret installation. This step is crucial for several reasons. First, it's essential that there are no residues left behind. Using this tool, a small saw, specifically designed for cleaning fret slots, we remove any leftover glue, wood particles, splinters, or debris that may remain inside the slot and prevent the fret from seating properly. The second reason is closely related. Our goal is for the fret to sit flush with the fingerboard surface, ensuring that we don't have to remove excessive material during the leveling stage. In other words, we want to avoid making the frets unnecessarily low. Keeping the frets as tall as possible is always beneficial. Of course, fret leveling is necessary after installation, but if the frets are brand new, it's ideal not to remove more material than needed. Poor slot cleaning can lead to improperly seated frets, which then require more leveling and reduce the fret's lifespan. That's why it's equally important to level the fingerboard itself until it's perfectly true. This way, we minimize the amount of material that needs to be removed from the frets, or even avoided altogether. A third point, again related, is that when refretting, especially on an instrument that has been exposed to climate changes, neglect, or even structural damage, there's a high chance the neck has undergone previous repairs. In this particular case, while working on the neck, I noticed signs of previous work, some refinishing on the body, minor touch-ups, and most notably a visible glue line running along the fretboard on the bass side near the first few frets. This repair may have caused the twisting present in the neck. Specifically, the treble side had a rise in the first frets and a dip just past that area. Additionally, there was a pronounced hump toward the higher frets. On the bass side, the middle area was also high, followed again by a rise in the upper frets. For this reason, it was absolutely critical to correct the issue at the wood level. Otherwise, the new frets would be compromised from the start. When replacing frets, they should be installed as if the neck was brand new. In a fret dressing, minor irregularities can be compensated directly on the fret tops. But when the issues are severe, as in this case, and the frets are already worn, you must address the problem at the wood level. Another issue that I suspect may have happened, I'm not entirely sure, but there are strong signs that this instrument had previously undergone a refret, and that may have contributed to the neck's twisting. When frets are pressed in too tightly, the wood tends to shift and compensate over time. Although removing the frets wasn't particularly difficult, something unusual happened. It felt like they wanted to remain in the slot. It was quite interesting. When correcting these kinds of issues, simulating string tension, the instrument is mounted in a neck jig, as seen here, with the appropriate indicators and supports. As I was saying, during this process, some fret slots can lose depth, and it's critical to re-establish that depth. Otherwise, the fret won't seat properly. And if we try to hammer or press in the fret without proper slot depth, it simply won't go in. I've seen this issue many times before. That's why fret slots must meet 3 essential conditions. First, they need to be completely clean and free of any debris. Second, when leveling the fingerboard, sanding dust tends to accumulate inside the slots. And if the previous frets were installed with glue, remnants of that are often left behind. Third, once the fingerboard is re-leveled, the slot no longer retains its original depth, so we must ensure the new depth is appropriate for the new fret wire. It's not always necessary to do what I'll demonstrate in this video. Sometimes cleaning the slots is enough. Other times it's necessary to recut them to the correct depth. On some instruments this is relatively easy, just run the slot saw through and you're done. However, in this case, the neck has binding, so we can't approach it that way. That's why we're going to use the method I'll show here. Before starting, I mentioned that I suspect this guitar had already been refretted. One sign was the fret bevels, which were inconsistent. I'm not sure if it was a partial refret or a complete one, but the bevel work was definitely off. Another clue is the damage to the binding. Although it's not entirely visible, there are several spots where the binding is cracked. Some of these were already damaged, and others have cracked during the current work. I'll show a few examples. Hopefully no more will break. This happens when the fret tang isn't clipped properly before installation. If you don't undercut the tang correctly, it can push against the binding and cause it to split. Here we can see multiple fractures directly at the slot. These types of cracks usually happen for two reasons. First, not installing the frets correctly. Second, with time and seasonal changes, two things happen. Wood swells or wood swells or shrinks. The frets don't do that as much. And that's an important difference, like on those instruments where the frets are showing at the sides of the fretboard and the finish breaks. Same thing. Only here is the binding that breaks. Also, as time passes, plastic dries up, and what once was flexible becomes brittle. That doesn't mean we can be careless. We have to be very careful when cleaning the slots, since binding may break with any small slip of the tool. I hope that won't happen. If it does, we can repair it later. Another option is to take off the binding, but that's a lot of unnecessary work, and probably not the most appropriate thing for a vintage instrument, since, as many of you surely know, it is advisable to keep the instrument as original as possible. That said, frets are like tires. They wear down and have to be replaced. But everything else is part of a document, let's call it that. So all this was the prior information before getting to it. Here's something I wanted to show you. This is a tool I consider extremely important, a fret slot depth gauge. It's very likely that many companies offer a similar tool, one of the most well-known being Stuart McDonald, which I'm sure many of you are already familiar with. This gauge has several measurements that correspond to different fingerboard radii. We have 10 to 14-inch radius range, which is the one I need for this instrument, 15 to 20, also flat, which is ideal for checking new frets, and from 7.25 to 9.5 as well. As I said before, I'll use 10 to 14 radii. So, what's the deal? I'm going to take one of the frets I removed from the guitar. Using the flat side of the gauge, we'll match it against the fret to estimate the tang's depth or height. This particular fret is already slightly curved, but by setting it on the flat side like this, we can get a general idea of how deep the slot needs to be. Normally, the tang of the fret won't extend beyond the second inner line on the gauge body, and that's something we need to keep in mind. When we insert the depth gauge into a fret slot, we should expect a similar depth reading. As you can see, in the slot I've already worked on, the gauge fits perfectly. If the reference lines aren't visible, you can feel that the tool drops in smoothly. However, when we move to the next fret slot, you can see how the gauge starts to rise and doesn't go down all the way. This tells us that the slot isn't deep enough, and the fret won't seat properly. The fret has the same tang height, and if the slot is too shallow, it simply won't allow the fret to fully settle. I hope I'm explaining this clearly. If not, feel free to leave your questions. I'm moving over to the other side, and something very similar is happening. The slot depth isn't the same, and won't go in completely. So what we're going to do is take our saw. I'm going to hold this area with my finger. Just in case I end up pushing on the binding, this way it won't break. I'm reinforcing it. Now I'll start cutting, but only on that side. I can also work slightly toward the center without reaching the opposite side of the slot. Right here, I'm protecting the binding to prevent it from breaking. Let's check again. And we can see that the slot now accepts the gauge perfectly. No issues at all. That means the slot is now properly cleaned and deep enough for the fret. However, on the other side, that's not the case yet. It's still sitting too high. So, I'm going to repeat the same process on that side. This saw cuts in both directions. One side cuts on the pull stroke, and the other cuts on the push. You have to be careful, because sometimes when the blade gets stuck and you apply too much force, it can slip. Fortunately, this time it didn't push the binding, but that can happen if you're not cautious. Let's try again with our depth gauge. And now the fret would fit just fine. This particular slot was fairly easy to clean. You can see the dust coming out. Whatever remains inside can be vacuumed out. Or just blown out with air. Now the tool slides from side to side with no resistance.
Entra.
Let's move on to the next slot. As you'll see, here the gauge doesn't go in all the way either. You can still see the internal reference line. So we're going to repeat the same process again. This time, I'll do it without applying support, just so you can clearly see what's happening. But we already know that applying finger support is essential to avoid pushing or cracking the binding. I'm being very careful, and I'm about to start. There, I pushed it a little bit. When the binding is dried out, it's very easy for it to crack. You can actually see a fracture line. Once there's a visible crack, the binding is already broken. If any section does break off, we'll likely see some oxidation in the exposed area. We just want to avoid completely separation. I've moved to the other side now. On this side, already there's no binding, so I'm not as concerned. This side is already fractured. I'm not sure if you can see it clearly, but there's a visible notch. Since there's no binding left, I won't worry as much. I'll just proceed carefully. In theory, once we glue it down, it won't be at much risk of coming loose once the fret is installed and glued in. Now I'm going to run a test. Wrong slot. I can see it goes down a bit better now. Still, we've got a bit more work to do. I'll focus on that area. We can slightly tilt the tool from sideways. This tool is quite thin, about 0.019 or 0.02 inches thick. So, by angling it just a bit, we can slightly open the slot to help the fret seat better, whether tilting to one side or the other. In this spot, it's going in nicely. You can see that it fits, so I'll move on to the next slot. And again, you can see that it doesn't go in. I'm applying pressure, and the tool still doesn't fully go down on either side. In fact, on the base side, it fits even less. Now, the hump on this fretboard was located precisely in this area. That's why we had to remove a good amount of wood on this side. On the opposite side, there was a dip, so we didn't remove as much, only what was necessary to level the surface and correct the fingerboard radius. Since the board was twisted, the radius wasn't correct to begin with. But in any case, the point is that we now need to widen and deepen this slot so the fret can seat properly. You can see there's already a fracture here. On the other side, we don't have one. Well, it's cracked, but the piece hasn't fallen off, unlike here, where a fragment already came off at the next fret slot. We're going to repeat the process. I'm going to hold the binding in place. We can see that a piece of glue came loose. So I have to work very carefully. I'm having a bit of difficulty here. If the slot feels too tight, or something is tough to remove, and you apply sudden force, you might punch through and damage the binding on the opposite side. As I mentioned, cracking the binding isn't too serious. It can be repaired. The real issue, which can also be repaired, would be if the binding gets completely torn off. That kind of damage isn't very likely with this guitar, because as I mentioned earlier, the binding is dry and brittle. What usually happens is that it just cracks in a specific area. On the last few frets, which were the first ones I started working on, the issues were limited to the fret ends. But now we've reached a section that had to be leveled more aggressively due to a hump in the fingerboard. That results in the entire fret slot being shallow. Here we can see another buildup of glue or some other residue. It's probably either epoxy or cyanoacrylate, though I'm inclined to think it's more likely epoxy. I've already nudged it slightly. I'll be more careful moving forward. We also need to be cautious not to cut into the neck. It's unlikely you'll go through the neck doing this, unless you're working with a guitar that has a very thin fingerboard. In vintage instruments, that's something to be aware of, so caution is key. Let's see how we're doing. There we go. At least on the treble side, the slot is ready. On the bass side, we still need a bit more work. So I'll focus only on that side now. There's resistance. Something's in the way. Cutting through wood is generally easier, but when there's glue residue, it's like trying to cut through stone. You have to be patient. Take it slow. This process can take up to 2 hours, or sometimes just 15 minutes. Each job is different. It's always very difficult to predict how it's going to turn out. But it's important to consider everything that might happen during the process. Now I'm going to check. There's still a bit of height. It's still slightly raised, so I'll work a little more on the bass side. There we go. Now it goes in fully. So, I'll move on to the next one. That would be the 6th fret. There's a small crack in the binding. I'm not sure if it's clearly visible. This is exactly what I was referring to. All the binding fractures, whether aligned with the fret slots or in other areas. Some of these occurred during the job. Others were already there. Honestly, I can't say for certain, but I'd estimate that about 3 of these small fragments came off during this refret process. Let's continue. Another thing I want to show, if it's visible on camera, is the difference between a slot that already has the proper depth and one that still needs some work, like 6th fret slot here. You can see it a bit there. I think it's noticeable. At 7th fret, not really. On fret 6, it's not very clear either. But on fret 5 and 4, you can clearly see less depth. Let's move on. Whoa, careful there. There's more glue here. Alright, this is the last slot I'm going to work on. I think everything's pretty clear by now. Again, if you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments section. By the way, this is a Hondo guitar. It's Japanese, from the 70s or 80s. I'm being very careful with the binding. Careful. Using light strokes so I don't push too hard. If the tool suddenly binds up, I increase pressure slowly. Not all at once, and definitely not with sudden force. We can see the dust coming out. And I'd also like to invite you to check out the other videos on the channel. Please feel free to leave your comments, let me know what you'd like to see. On the bass side, the slot is already fine. On the treble side, it's close, but not quite there. It fits, but just to be sure, I'll go a bit deeper. Back to the comments. What do you think of the videos? Thinking this content is aimed less at casual enthusiasts and more at people who actually want to get into this and struggle to find good learning resources, real-life examples of how refret work is done, or how to perform proper setup and adjustments. Now I'll do the last one. First, I take the measurement. We can clearly see that this one needs much more material removed than the previous slot. This was the area where the hump started, and probably where the neck twist was most severe. In the first frets, the treble side was raised and the bass side was low. Then, right around here, the hump began. And if you're enjoying the channel, aside from inviting you to watch the other videos, please consider subscribing, hitting the like button if you found this video helpful, and activating notifications so these videos can reach more people. The next step will be to slightly bevel the edges of the slots, forming a shallow V shape inside. This makes it easier to insert the fret tang and helps prevent the slots from chipping or breaking when removing frets in future refret jobs. After that, we'll prep the fret itself. Let's check the current status. At this point, we already have good depth right in the center of the slot. But we're still a little short. So we're going to carefully work on the ends. Gently and with precision. Let's not forget we're working with brittle binding. Just because this is an older instrument doesn't mean we should be less cautious on new instruments. Even new instruments can suffer binding damage if mishandled. That's why, on any instrument, we should always work with the highest level of care. Let's take a look. The slot is almost ready. Basically, this whole process has been the same, from the last fret up to now, and it'll continue more or less the same until we reach the first fret. There are 4 fret slots left to go after this. I'm going to wrap it up here. If you made it to the end, thank you so much for watching this video. Once again, I hope you found it enjoyable and informative. Don't forget to subscribe, hit the like button, turn on notifications, and share the video. Things are starting to get a bit tricky now. As I mentioned earlier, some fret slots are easier than others. I think this one here was very easy, but others, like this 5th fret slot, are definitely more challenging. I'll stop here. Once again, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.